Yo, what's good, folks? First and foremost, I want to say thank you to everybody here at the Breathwork community for their feedback on the original isometric video and all of the support and the encouragement that was given on that video was really inspiring. And it let me know that, this is a good way to express some of these ideas that can be very beneficial in not only helping us, improve our lives, but also just help us create an amalgamated sort of protocols that we can utilize in order to handle the things that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. And so with that being said, this particular video is going to go over some information that wasn't covered in the first video, but is very prevalent and very important to the topic. And in this particular video, we're going to cover 5 primary facets of the practice. We're going to go over the automatic relaxation response. I keep on saying reflex for some reason. CNS fatigue, or central nervous system fatigue. What else do we got here? How isometrics strengthens the fine muscles of the respiratory system. Other forms of self-resistant body work, and whether or not you need to use maximum contraction or maximum tension when you're doing isometrics. Okay? So, the first topic I'm going to talk about is the automatic reflex response. Now, with this, relaxation response. I keep on saying reflex. I think I want to say relaxation reflex. But for some reason, relaxation and reflex are melding in my mind together. So if I make that mistake again, you know where it's coming from. But in any case, when we're performing the self-resistance isometrics that we were talking about in the first video, we're utilizing maximum contraction, right? And because we're using maximum contraction over a period of time, the body's response to that maximum contraction is to have a reciprocal and equivalent relaxation response. This is why I have reflex in my mind, because the relaxation is a reflex response to the maximum contractions that we have. And so when we're practicing this modality, the relaxation response is just as important as the maximum tension that we're generating, primarily because of the ability to not only control our muscles, but also how it actually helps all of that energy dissipate and get to where it needs to go. If that reflex response didn't happen, you would have all of that nervous energy trapped in the muscles that you were actually utilizing. So when you're doing this prayer pose, instead of that energy wafting out and moving throughout the system and being allowed to energize the system and reorient itself towards more beneficial purposes within the body, you would end up with a situation where that energy would just be trapped. And so that automatic relaxation response is very important to recognize when we're doing this practice, because that relaxation response is really where the transformation of the energy from a negative, non-beneficial state goes into a positive and uplifting state, right? So it's very important that after we do that maximum contraction, that we pay attention to the relaxation that comes afterwards. And that relaxation is really where the release of all of that particular energy that's going into the negative emotions, or the emotions that aren't serving you, or the mindsets that aren't serving you, that is what allows that energy to dissolve and to be repurposed towards a beneficial towards a beneficial goal or beneficial transformation of your personal being, right? And so, in light of that, there are some risks that can occur when you are utilizing isometrics. Now, in terms of the purpose of what we were talking about utilizing isometrics for, which is primarily to readjust our personal framework so that we can get out of a state of being downtrodden or not being able to be productive to a state of beneficial movement and beneficial productivity. Um, the risk of central nervous fatigue, or what I put CNS, the risk of central nervous fatigue is very low. And the reason for that is that you're not likely to have 100 situations within a day where you're going to want to be readjusting yourself through isometrics. Okay? More than likely, it will be at most about 10 situations throughout the day. Because even though these exercises are very compact and they don't take a lot of time, their benefits have a long lasting capacity. It's not very likely that if you are utilizing this to get yourself out of a state of manic anger, that you're going to sit up there and 5 minutes later you're angry again. Okay? But all that is to say is that you want to be careful of not overdoing it within a particular day. And if you do need to take a break, you want to be able to take a break of around a day or so in order for the central nervous system to not wind up being overly fatigued. Now, I can tell you from my own personal experiences that when I've utilized isometrics just as a fitness and general health building activity, I have never experienced central nervous system fatigue. And most of the time I hear people talking about central nervous system fatigue, it's because they're holding maximum or close to maximum contractions or close to maximum tension in a particular exercise for several minutes at a time over several different exercises. So if we talk about this prayer pose, we're talking about individuals holding this prayer pose at anywhere from about 75 to 100% maximum contraction for 2 to 3 minutes at a time, and then doing about 10 or 15 different exercises that go that way. If you are doing isometrics in that fashion, then you're more than likely going to want to have breaks in between. You don't want to do that type of practice for 5 straight days on end, because what will end up happening is that you can burn your nervous system out. And it's not something that is a permanent situation, but for maybe a day, 2 days straight, you might find yourself feeling very weak. And that's just because your nervous system needs to just chill out. And it's going to go into chill out mode. And because it's going to be in chill out mode, you're just going to be sitting there like, I need to wash my behind, but I cannot lift the washcloth or soap. Ugh. You don't want that to happen, right? You don't want that to end up being the case. So that's something that you want to be aware of. Now, the third aspect that we're going to get into talking about is how isometrics supports the fine muscles that surround the breathing mechanisms and other organs within the body. First and foremost, when you're talking about practicing isometrics, one of the main aspects of this practice is its ability to recruit muscles in a way that other forms of exercise don't. Because you're focusing, especially when you're trying to generate maximum tension, you're focusing on doing something that recruits a maximum amount of muscle fibers. And due to that, many muscle fibers that in regular exercise can go largely ignored, because a lot of people aren't doing their exercises in a fashion where they pay attention to the operation of their muscles itself, but rather they are focusing on the performance of an activity using muscular power. So for example, if you're talking about a push-up, many times you'll see people doing a push-up and they're just doing their push-up to push out as many push-ups as possible. When you're talking about going at exercise in that fashion, the whole goal is to get as many push-ups out as possible. The goal isn't necessarily to use your muscles in the most sound, efficient fashion and the most complete and healthy fashion. And therefore, what ends up happening is that the muscles that are the most active are the ones doing the most work. Whereas certain muscles that may not be normally recruited will tend to just not get any activation at all. But if you were to focus on doing a push-up using, and you wanted to pay attention to how your muscles perform the activity, most of the time you're going to get a performance of the activity that demonstrates vastly different experiences than normal, right? So in relation to the practice of isometrics, when we are practicing isometrics, we are recruiting a maximum amount of muscle fibers, and in turn, many muscle fibers that are normally inactive start to fire up. And as a result, many of the muscles that surround not only our lungs, but also other muscle, but other organs, these things get activated and they are able to perform a lot better. And so when we were talking about the prayer pose and the wing pose, right? These both work the chest and the back, but they also work the core. In fact, when we're talking about isometrics, it's very rare that you're going to perform self-resistance isometrics without recruiting the core. If you do this exercise and you just hold a little bit of light tension, you're going to see that your abdominal muscles are recruited. Okay? When you're doing this, when you breathe in and when you do that breathing, boom, your abdominals are recruited. The abdomen and these upper body muscles are extremely important to the function of your lungs and how well they're able to expand and contract. So, when you're doing these exercises, you are aiding your ability to maximize the function of your respiratory system. And in the practice of breath work, something of this nature is absolutely indispensable. Again, in fact, you can consider isometrics, or at least a self-resistance maximum isometrics that we're doing, you can consider them to not only be a strength building exercise and a personal reorientation exercise, you can consider them to also be an organ exercise. Okay? And the more powerful and the more supported and the more muscles are active in the breathing mechanism, the better your breathing mechanisms are going to work. Okay? Now, the fourth topic that we want to bring up is whether or not isometrics need to be performed using maximum contraction. In the effort of what we were talking about in the first video, if you want that quick readjustment, then utilizing maximum contraction has a lot of great benefits. However, you don't need to hold this prayer pose all the time in terms of maximum contraction, because there are other ways that isometrics can help you improve your body. And in fact, if you hold this at, let's say, 50% contraction over a period of time, and you just breathe through this time, if you see, my body is moving a little bit, even though it's supposed to be still, and that's because as I'm holding that contraction, my body is starting to place attention on areas of my body that might be out of place, that might be um, blocked with some form of musculoskeletal blockage, it can help teach you a lot about the mainframe of your body. In the first video, I was talking about holding an isometric contraction so that you can actually identify whether or not a particular problem that you're having has a physical root in a particular area of the body. And by doing so, you can actually figure out where these traumas are locked in, and you can start to do isometrics that specifically can release the tension and the blocked energy that is in those particular areas of the body. Okay, so we don't need to do that. In fact, many of you are probably already familiar with isometrics that don't utilize maximum or even effortful contraction overall. Many of us are familiar with yoga asanas. When an isometric exercise is, what it does, or how it's performed, is when the muscles, or when one or several muscle groups are locked in a fixed position where they don't move for a period of time. You don't need to actually generate tension in an effortful way in order to be in an isometric contraction. In fact, if you just put your hands out like this and you hold them there for a certain period of time, this is an isometric contraction, and it's for your chest, for your shoulders, for your arms, for certain parts of your back, for your core, and even for fine muscles in your neck. Okay, that is an isometric contraction. And so isometrics doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be pushing maximally in order to do it. It's just that when it comes to training strength, this is one of the best ways to advance your musculoskeletal strength, along with enhancing bone density, along with enhancing tendon strength, and ligament strength, and things of that nature. So you don't need to actually perform these in that fashion, and you can actually use sub-maximal contraction. That is to say, somewhere in the realm of 50, or as low as even like 30% of your maximum contraction level. And you can use that to actually learn a lot about your body. You might not know that you actually have stiff shoulders, right? But when you do this and you've been holding it for 30 seconds, all of a sudden you're going to start to realize, hey, something's going on in my shoulders. Like, you can see this right now. You see that hop right there? That's not voluntary. That's not voluntary. None of this is voluntary right here. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that due to certain injuries and injurious behavior that I've had in the past, there's a lot of locked and misaligned musculoskeletal framework that I deal with on a day-to-day basis. And luckily, utilizing breath work and utilizing things like isometrics and other forms of self-resistance work, I am able to rectify and heal these particular problems. Which brings me to the last aspect of this particular video, which is other forms of self-resistance work. Now, when we're talking about the self-resistance, as we said, we're utilizing our limbs, to create tension within our body in order to build ourselves up, right? And while isometrics is a self-resistance exercise that has you standing in a fixed position, it doesn't mean that this is the only form of self-resistance work. If you want to learn a lot about self-resistance work, and an individual who would be considered the godfather of self-resistance work, Charles Atlas and his course Dynamic Tension is one of the Bibles of this kind of work. For anyone who used to read old school comic books, comic books that came from maybe as early as the mid 60s all the way until like the mid to late 80s. There's always advertisements for goofy gadgets and like books on being a magician and things of that nature. And in many of those comic books, you would see an advertisement talking about fitness. and it'll be like this little comic, this cheesy comic book, this cheesy sort of like comic advertisement with these panels, and it shows this little weakling who used to get picked on and doesn't get the girls, going and utilizing Charles Atlas dynamic tension course and coming back and being a stud and getting the girl and being macho and everything like that. It's a really goofy advertisement, but that doesn't belie the value of the content that that manual has. If it wasn't for Charles Atlas's dynamic tension, I wouldn't be doing this type of work right now. And I can tell you that that particular form of work is the Western equivalent to Indian yoga and Chinese Qigong. In fact, if it wasn't for that exercise, I'd be completely inept when it comes to doing physical yoga, because man, like when you start out physical yoga and you're not necessarily, your body's constitution isn't necessarily strong enough to do those things with high levels of proficiency, it could be pretty discouraging. But then I do this stuff for 2 weeks just for fun, and the next thing I know, my flexibility is through the roof, my body looks like it's in great shape, and certain things that I was never able to do before, I'm able to do with relative ease. Okay, and this is 2 weeks and not even doing these things regimented. And so when we're talking about this particular form of work, let's just take the butterfly for instance. Now, when we did the butterfly exercise, we did the butterfly exercise as a isometric contraction, just holding it like this. Now you can do isometrics in any vector that these legs will go. So you can start the contraction up here and the midpoint all the way down, wherever you want to start it. But if we were to do it in a dynamic tension way, instead of holding it, we would have the resistance placed, the legs pushing on the hands and the hands pushing forward on the legs, and we bring it in. I like to breathe out, and then we bring it back down. That's just dynamic tension, okay? And these exercises have very similar benefits for the musculoskeletal system, and due to the way that they help recruit muscles through their performance, you have the ability to drastically activate the fine muscle fibers that normally go ignored or underutilized in regular exercise. Now, I'm not trying to tout this as the best form of exercise, and that's not really the case. I mean, that's not really the goal here. We're talking about how these things can help you transform in the best way possible, and how they can support this breathwork activity that we're learning here. More importantly, as you get into this practice, you start to figure out your own forms of dynamic tension and self-resistance isometrics. So all that is to say, we've covered the supplemental information, and I think the next video I'm going to cover will be talking about the occurrence of muscle armor. And this is going to really talk specifically about how breath work really helps to break down that stuff, the muscle armor, because muscle armor has a great deal to do with the locked in traumas that activate certain non-beneficial emotional and mental traits. So that's all for this, and until next time, peace.